but you were always on my mind.
On a humid Texas night in 1975, Willie Nelson, the man America would eventually celebrate at his 93rd birthday tribute as a living legend, was simultaneously the most celebrated and most despised man in country music. The radio loved him. Nashville's establishment despised him. Here was a man who had written more hit songs than most artists would record in a lifetime, yet he couldn't get a record deal that didn't demand he become someone else. His voice, that weathered, intimate rasp that would eventually define an era and inspire artists like Casey Musgraves and Miranda Lambert, was considered too strange, too unmarketable, too honest. And so here he sat in a rented room in Austin, Texas, counting down the days until his next birthday, wondering if he'd still be alive to see it, with everything he owned fitting into a pickup truck, smoking a joint that would become his most visible rebellion, staring at a future that looked exactly like his past, rejection masquerading as opportunity. The question echoing through his mind was simple and devastating. Is Willie Nelson still alive, and how old is he going to be if he keeps living like this? There is an irony in Willie Nelson's story that cuts deeper than any wound shaped by circumstance alone. The child who grew up in the segregated, impoverished pine forests of East Texas, a boy whose mother abandoned the family when he was 6 months old, whose father wasn't. Emotionally absent mechanic who spoke more to engines than to his sons, learned very early that silence was safer than connection. The teenager who discovered that a guitar could say everything his voice couldn't, who taught himself to play using a cheap instrument with steel strings that bit into his young fingers until they bled, found in music the acceptance his family would never provide. The man who built an entire philosophy around authenticity and outlaw ethics, someone who refused every industry demand to surgically alter his voice, dye his hair, or pretend to be anyone other than Willie fucking Nelson, had constructed his entire identity on being the one thing the world told him he couldn't be: himself. And then, decades after becoming a legend, after his name became synonymous with resilience, and after he inspired the outlaw country movement that would eventually influence artists like David Allan Coe, fate would begin systematically dismantling the very things that kept him whole. Arthritis would attack the fingers that made magic. Lung problems would threaten the voice that changed country music forever. Addiction would circle like a predator, waiting for moments of weakness, asking the question that haunted him: when is Willie Nelson's birthday going to be his last? But how did a boy abandoned by his mother become the man who taught America that honesty wasn't a liability but a superpower? How did someone rejected by every major label in Nashville become the voice of an entire generation's refusal to conform? What is Willie Nelson's greatest hits if not a roadmap of someone who refused to break? And what happens when the body of a man who built his legend on defiance begins to betray him, when the very flesh that carried him through decades of struggle starts to fail at the exact moment he should be enjoying the fruits of immortality, still not dead, but feeling the weight of time? To understand all of that, we must go back to the beginning, to Abbott, Texas, in 1933, to a boy born on April 29th who learned in the cruelest way possible that love is not guaranteed, and that sometimes the people who should protect you simply leave. Willie Hugh Nelson was born into a world already fractured by poverty and abandonment. His father, William Alfred Nelson, was a mechanic by trade and a silent man by temperament. The kind of father who fixed things because he couldn't know how to communicate with the humans he'd created. His mother, Myrtle Marie, was a piano player who understood beauty and melody, but not motherhood. 6 months after Willie arrived, 6 months of infancy when a child learns whether the world is safe or dangerous, she walked out of their lives completely. No explanation, no goodbye. Just an absence that would reverberate through every relationship Willie would ever attempt to build, every song he would write, every birthday he would celebrate, knowing that loss was the fundamental language of his existence. His older sister Bobby became his everything, protector, caregiver, the only consistent love in a house where silence had replaced conversation and where warmth was as rare as prosperity. The Abbott of the 1930s was a place where poverty wasn't an exception, but the default setting, the texture of existence itself. The Great Depression had hollowed out what little prosperity existed in rural Texas. Homes were wooden structures that sweated heat in summer and leaked cold in winter. Families survived by growing what they could eat and working whatever jobs the town could provide. The Nelson house was no different, modest, spare, suffused with the kind of emotional distance that only happens when people are too exhausted to reach toward each other. Willie learned very early that his father's silence wasn't respect or contemplation. It was abandonment wearing a different mask, and it taught him that men don't teach, don't explain, and don't waste words on their children. By age 6, after years of observing his father move through life like a ghost, Willie had internalized a devastating conclusion. He was not worth speaking to. The boy who should have been taught how to be a man learned instead that masculinity was measured in absence. This wound, this absolute certainty of unworthiness, became the foundation of everything that would follow. He would spend decades trying to prove to a specter that he was worthy of acknowledgement, and it was this desperate hunger for validation that would fuel his greatest songs and his most destructive addictions. It was his sister Bobby who handed him salvation in the form of a Spanish guitar when he was 7 years old. She was a pianist with genuine talent, someone who understood that music could say what the mouth couldn't articulate. She showed her little brother that the guitar wasn't just an instrument, but a voice, raw, honest, capable of expressing everything locked inside a child too afraid to speak. Those first strings hurt. They bled, but they also sang in a way his voice never could, creating a duality that would define his entire existence. The person who couldn't speak, and the artist who couldn't stop speaking. By age 9, Willie had his first job performing, playing in a polka band at local dances. The irony was immediate and crushing. The boy who couldn't speak to his own father was singing to strangers, and strangers loved him. The boy rejected by the one man who should have shown him worthiness was being validated by crowds of farmers and working people who recognized something true in his voice. Music had become a substitute for love, and like all substitutes, it was both salvation and poison. It saved him from silence. It also taught him that the only way to be loved was to perform, to give, to exhaust himself on the altar of someone else's emotions. By age 15, Willie was already writing songs with the sophistication of someone twice his age. Not covers, not interpretations of other people's pain, but his own articulations of what it felt like to be alive in a body that wasn't enough, in a family that had broken, in a world that demanded you be someone other than yourself. Songs like Funny How Time Slips Away, a composition that would eventually become one of Willie Nelson's greatest hits, weren't just clever musical constructions. They were the voice of a young man who understood loss before he'd even fully lived, who grasped mortality before he'd experienced triumph. But success in a small Texas town was not success in the world. And in 1950, at 17 years old, with high school offering nothing but the promise of a future identical to his father's, work, silence, and slow erasure, Willie made a decision that seemed, at the time, like the only possible path. He joined the Air Force. At least there, he thought, there would be structure. At least there he could be told exactly who he was supposed to be, since he'd never been able to figure it out on his own. At least there, in the military's rigid hierarchy, he wouldn't have to wonder any more about his worth. He lasted 9 months. A back injury during training gave him the exit he needed, though in truth, the injury was almost merciful, a physical embodiment of how desperately his body wanted to escape. How? Completely his spirit refused to be contained by anyone else's rules, even the military's. He returned to Texas with nothing but a guitar and the absolute conviction that Nashville, Tennessee was where his real life would begin, where he would finally prove his worth to a ghost who would never acknowledge him. Nashville in 1956 was not a city that welcomed dreamers. It was a city that consumed them. Willie Nelson arrived with a guitar, a voice that sounded like gravel and honey mixed together, and absolutely nothing else. No connections, no family money, no safety net. The question that would haunt him for the next decade wasn't whether he would succeed, it was whether he would survive long enough to matter. He had maybe $200 in his pocket, a name nobody recognized, and the kind of desperation that only comes from having nothing to lose because you've already lost everything that matters. He found a room in a boarding house on Nashville's east side, the kind of place where other failed musicians lived, where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors. Heartbreak through the plaster. Nashville in the 1950s was not kind to strange voices. The industry wanted crooners, wanted polish, wanted singers who sounded like they'd been manufactured in a laboratory rather than forged in the furnace of actual pain. Willie's voice was none of those things. It was intimate in a way that made record executives uncomfortable. It sounded like he was singing directly to you, not performing for a crowd. It sounded authentic, and authenticity was expensive because it couldn't be controlled or packaged or sold like a commodity. He took a job as a window dresser at a department store, 40 hours a week arranging mannequins in poses that were supposed to make people want to buy things they didn't need. There was a particular cruelty to this work for someone like Willie. He was literally creating illusions while his own life was collapsing into nothing. He washed dishes in the back kitchens of hotels where wealthy people ate meals that cost more than he made in a week. He drove a taxi through the rain-slicked streets of Nashville at night, ferrying drunk businessmen who never made eye contact, never acknowledged that the person behind the wheel was a human being with dreams. He loaded boxes at a warehouse, his back already damaged from his Air Force injury, the pain a constant reminder that his body was betraying him before his talent ever got a chance to prove itself. But every night, after these exhausting shifts, Willie would return to his boarding house room and play guitar until his fingers bled again. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't the calculated ambition of someone with a plan. This was compulsion. This was survival. The guitar was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did, the only conversation partner in a city of strangers, the only way he could speak to himself without judgment. In 1957, Willie finally got his first recording contract with a label called Urca Records. The executives told him exactly what they wanted. They wanted him to sound like Hank Williams. They wanted crooning. They wanted polish. They wanted the rough edges sanded smooth until he was commercially viable. They took his voice and tried to manufacture it, dressing it up in orchestration and backing vocals designed to hide what made it unique. The songs they released, like Calling You and Never You Mind, disappeared into the void like stones thrown into an ocean. Nobody remembered them. Nobody cared. For Willie, these early recordings were a kind of professional death, proof that the industry didn't want what he was offering. He was dropped from Arca. This was supposed to be his big break, and instead it was a humiliation, a public rejection that meant he had to return to the boarding house, return to washing dishes, return to the taxis and the warehouse jobs. But something essential happened during this failure. Willie learned that the industry didn't know how to market truth. They wanted lies that looked like truth. They wanted constructed authenticity. And so he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would stop trying to be what they wanted and start writing what he felt. He began writing songs with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He wrote Family Bible, Crazy, Hello Walls. These weren't attempts to sound like someone else. These were Willie Nelson songs, songs that sounded like someone had taken a knife and cut open their own chest to show you what was bleeding inside. These songs were rejected by every major label in Nashville. The industry looked at them and said, "Too weird, too introspective, too honest. The voice doesn't fit our format. You're not marketable. You will never be a star. By 1960, Willie was 30 years old. Most of his 20s had been consumed by failure, by rejection, by the slow erosion of hope that comes from trying to become something the world doesn't want. He was working as a songwriter for other artists, writing hits that other people would sing and profit from while he remained anonymous. He wrote Crazy for Patsy Cline, and it became one of the greatest country songs ever recorded. But Patsy's version was the one that mattered. Willie's version was forgotten. He was the invisible man behind the curtain, the architect of other people's success, which meant he was also the living proof that you could be talented and still be worthless. The marriage he'd entered into in 1952 to a woman named Martha Matthews was deteriorating under the weight of poverty and his obsession with music. Martha wanted a husband who came home at normal hours and brought home a stable paycheck. Willie was someone who couldn't stop writing songs in the middle of the night, who couldn't stop playing music even when it was destroying their financial security. By 1962, the marriage had fractured completely. He was divorced, alone, deeper in debt than he'd ever been, and working at a radio station for wages so small they barely qualified as income. The absolute lowest point came in 1965 when Willie was 32 years old. He had been in Nashville for nearly a decade. He had written some of the greatest country songs ever created. He had watched other artists become superstars using songs he had written. He had nothing. He was living in a small apartment in Nashville, barely able to pay rent, watching his career die in slow motion while the industry moved on to younger, prettier, more marketable singers. His first marriage had failed. He had a son, Willie Jr., whom he could barely afford to support. He was addicted to painkillers for his back injury, and the addiction was beginning to consume him in the same way the rejection was consuming him. One night, sitting alone in that apartment with a bottle of whiskey and a guitar that was the only thing of value he still owned, Willie made a decision. He decided that if Nashville didn't want him as an artist, he would leave Nashville entirely. He would go back to Texas. He would give up. He would admit defeat to the ghost of his father and accept that he was never going to be anything other than a failure. He packed his belongings into that same truck he'd arrived in years earlier. The truck that was supposed to carry him to stardom now carried him toward extinction. He drove through the night, away from Nashville, away from the music industry, away from the dream that had consumed and destroyed him. He was still not dead, as he would later say with dark humor, but he was certainly not alive. He was something in between, a ghost haunting his own existence, a man who had tried to prove his worth and found that the world had decided he didn't have any. The question that echoed through his mind as he drove back to Texas wasn't hopeful. It wasn't about when is Willie Nelson's birthday going to matter to someone. It was simply, what now? How do you rebuild when everything has been destroyed? How do you become yourself when the world has already decided who you're allowed to be? What Willie didn't yet understand was that his lowest point was actually the hinge on which his entire life would turn. That leaving Nashville wasn't failure. It was the beginning of everything.